It is not creative, it is limited by our data, by our resources, by mathematical and natural laws, and won't get better forever. We live in a world where generative AI paints pictures, composes music, and writes stories that seem so creative you can barely tell them apart from human art. But is that really the case? Is generative AI truly creative and will it replace art? The short answer is no. I say generative AI is not creative and will never replace human art. I will show you why you have to steal lots of data without permission and infringe copyright laws to make a good generative AI tool, and why art such as music, pictures, films, and even voice acting are not really at risk. This is a complex topic, but easier to understand than you might think. And yes, this is a more optimistic view, since most people have a more pessimistic view on it. But first, how does generative AI work? Here's a simplified way to explain it. Generative AI analyzes huge amounts of data. For example, we train a generative AI with 1000 pictures of me, all on a white background, with a beard and bun. Then it tries to understand all the patterns. So the generative AI learns what I look like, my beard, my bun, and other features, and memorizes this information, and creates new images of me based on the learned 1000 images. But what this generative AI cannot do is, for example, insert a forest instead of the white background, or a completely new hairstyle, not even with a prompt. Why? Well, the generative AI from my example doesn't know a forest or other hairstyles, because we only trained it with 1000 images with bun hairstyle and white backgrounds. It can only do what a prompter tells it to do, and even then it is limited to what it has learned. And these are exactly the two limiting factors. These will become relevant again later to understand the full extent. Limited data. The results will only ever be as good as the training data is, so it is limited here. The generative AI from my previous example cannot create a forest, because it simply doesn't know what a forest is, or what it looks like. A human would have exactly the same problem, by the way. If someone had to paint a forest but didn't know what it was, it would be impossible for them to paint it. But what sets us apart from generative AI is the second factor: lack of creativity. Creativity is creating something that is both useful and original. A generative AI can create original combinations, but it lacks the conscious intention or understanding to turn them into something truly useful. If we tell the generative AI from my example to create long open hair, it will not be able to create that, since the generative AI only knows one hairstyle, a bun. A human on the other side is aware that hair could be styled differently, even if a human only knew one hairstyle. This intuition, this awareness, which often arises from experiences and emotions, and also from breaking rules and taking risks in order to create something useful and original. That's creativity. So we cannot tell this generative AI to create a new hairstyle because it's not creative on its own. It doesn't give us anything original or meaningful unless by pure chance. But even then, only we can judge if it's useful or not the generative AI itself. Instead, you have to describe exactly what you want. The creativity comes from the prompter or from the programmer, but never from the generative AI itself. Let's assume there are 4 book authors. One is skilled, creative, and works without using a generative AI tool. One is skilled, creative, and works with a generative AI tool as support. One is skilled, creative, but uses generative AI and relies completely on its output. And finally, one is a beginner, not very skilled or creative, and uses generative AI. The first author works with their own abilities, like always. The second author is probably in the best position, because they are not limited to what generative AI can do, but can use it as support when useful. The third author is already limited, because even if they write creative prompts, the generative AI still can't create more than what it has learned, so they are stuck with the generative AI's limits. The fourth author doesn't have the skills or creativity to give good instructions to the generative AI, and often can't even judge if the results are any good. From this, we can see that people who are already good at their work may become even better when using generative AI as a tool, without limiting themselves. But all of them are still better than amateurs using generative AI, and probably always will be, except by pure chance. It's the same with music. Non-professionals can use generative AI tools for music as much as they want to, but it will never be as good as when a skilled and creative musician creates it themselves, or even just uses generative AI as a helper without relying on the full output. Again, except by pure chance. And with music, there's a problem with generative AI that is even more obvious than with images or text. I will show you what I mean with an example. Generative AI could theoretically create pretty good pop songs by analyzing all the #1 chart hits. But again, we would run into the same problem. It can't create anything better or more original than the songs it was trained on, because it only knows what's already familiar from those songs. Even if a song from generative AI made it to the #1 in the charts, the generative AI would then train on its own songs. And over time, this would slowly turn into one big repetitive blend of similar songs. On top of these two big problems, there's still no real creativity in generative AI. It could never create anything truly revolutionary. Even with the best prompts, the generative AI can only create variations from the songs that already exist. And with every new song, this effect would only get stronger, leading to more and more uniform music over time. More about this later in the video when I talk about the dead internet theory. The transition from classical to atonal music or the emergence of hip-hop could have never taken place with generative AI, especially since this would, and already does, raise serious legal and moral questions. Which songs are even allowed to be used for analysis and training? Who owns the rights? Is it copying or just inspiration? And there are many more questions like that. I personally would say you definitely need either a license or a permission from the creators to train your generative AI on their work. Because technically the AI doesn't just listen to the music like we would, it has to copy, load and process the full data to analyze it. And copying someone else's work without permission is exactly what copyright law normally protects against. Some might argue, well, if a human is listening to all the songs and creates something similar, why isn't the generative AI allowed to do the same? But I wouldn't call that inspiration. For real inspiration, you need creativity and consciousness. Generative AI doesn't have any of that. It doesn't get inspired, it simply copies patterns mathematically. It's not conscious, it doesn't think, it doesn't feel, it just calculates. They can only be that good because they were trained on an unimaginable amount of copyrighted data they never had permissions for. That's why big companies try to make you give them your data for free so they can train their generative AIs legally. The term dead internet theory is often tied to conspiracy theories, but here I'm using it to describe a real and growing problem online. It's the idea that more and more content online is not created by human but automatically generated by generative AI. One obvious problem with that is that we don't know if what we were seeing or reading came from a real person or from generative AI. But the bigger problem is that the more generative AI generated content there is, the worse it gets. Because at some point, generative AI starts learning from the content that was made by other generative AI. And that creates a loop where everything slowly becomes more repetitive and less usable. And that is the case with everything generative AI does. I personally don't think that generative AI will ever be good enough to consistently write songs that reach #1 in the charts, or even get a lot of listeners in general. Unless maybe we create a new genre called generative AI songs that could have its own niche audience. But I think generative AI could only make bangers by accident. Then again, so could we. So realistically, generative AI will just add even more songs to the hundreds of thousands already being uploaded to Spotify every day. Most of those probably don't even get more than 100 listeners. Let's be real, the most important thing is and has always been marketing. It doesn't matter if you have bangers or not, or if your songs are the best in the world. If no one knows about them, no one is going to know them. It's that easy. I see generative AI simply as a tool. Skilled people can use it to make their work more efficient, and beginners can use it to do more than they normally could, or just having fun playing with it. But that's where it ends. It's just a tool, nothing more. Before I dive into the last chapter, I want to quickly tell you about two more things: the neural scaling laws and the Gödel's incompleteness theorems. I will keep it short and simple. For the neural scaling laws, I recommend watching this really well made video. The video shows that generative AI probably cannot keep scaling forever unless it gets bigger and better models, better and more data, smarter algorithms, and most importantly, way more compute. And the thing is, we don't have an infinite amount of resources or money for that. so it will hit its limits at some point. So saying, oh my god, it gets better and better, how will it look like in 10 years? Forever does probably not make that much sense. We might already be close to the point where making generative AI better gets a lot harder. I mean, we might also not, but yeah, this is my assertion. The Gödel's incompleteness theorems is about the algorithm part of the generative AI thing, and it's a bit more complicated, but I will just give you a simplified example. Let's say there's a sentence like this. I am lying right now. If the sentence is true, then I am lying, but that means the sentence is actually false. If the sentence is false, then I'm not lying, so the sentence is true. Gödel did something similar. He built a statement using math and logic that essentially says, this statement cannot be proven in this system. If the system could prove that statement, it would be proving something false. If the system can't prove it, the statement is actually true, but unprovable. In other words, Gödel's theorem basically means that even in perfect logical systems or algorithms, some true statements can never be proven. And generative AIs are built upon algorithms. That doesn't mean Gödel's theorems directly limit everything AI can do, but it does remind us that there are theoretical limits to what any algorithmic system can fully do or prove. Now let me quickly explain what the real problem might be and why I have said generative AI over 100 times in this video instead of just calling it AI. Above generative AI there's also AGI, Artificial General Intelligence, and above AGI there's ASI, Artificial Superintelligence. Unlike generative AI, AGI could potentially handle almost any intellectual task a human can. But so far there's no evidence that AGI is even possible. Scientists and philosophers are still only offering assertions about this topic and not facts, because nobody knows how AGIs could work and how close we actually are for creating an AGI. Nobody knows if consciousness is necessary for AGIs to exist or if it could exist without being conscious. We also don't know how consciousness arises, whether it can be created or whether a system might become conscious simply by being advanced enough. We don't have answers to any of these questions yet. The thing is, AIs without consciousness will probably just act as if they have consciousness. In the end, it would also require incredibly efficient hardware, algorithms, and knowledge we don't have yet. But we will have quantum computers in the future. I recommend watching this video. She explains why quantum computers might not be the best tool for AIs. I personally would say AI needs to be conscious in order to do some of the most important things that human can do or have. And that's when I would actually be worried. But for now, let's just look on the bright side. I just have less important questions I want to share with you. Do we really want to create everything with generative AI? If we didn't have human-made art, wouldn't everything feel completely soulless? And I don't mean using it as a helpful tool, I mean replacing real people. The other day I saw a video from a German YouTuber featuring voice actors, and it made me so happy. These are the voices that shaped my childhood. I genuinely love them for their work. I don't know how it is in your country, but here in Germany the voice actors are top notch. And honestly, it's the same with everything that has to do with art. Do we really have to cut everything for profit? Or can everything be cut for profit? I mean, I don't believe in that. Let's be honest, everything that generative AI can do, it can only do because of our hard work, our creativity. And yet some companies just steal it and use it to generate profit without permission. It should not work that way, and I don't think it will work long term. Ed Sheeran is one of my favorite artists ever. I don't just love his music, I respect him as a person. I can hear his stories and his life in his songs. I remember watching him on YouTube way before he was famous, just doing street music. You don't get that kind of connection from generative AI. The same goes for all shows and anime I watched. They wouldn't feel as real or brilliant if the voice actors weren't real people. Art needs authenticity. Without that, it doesn't work. Not long term. And I don't think we would want it to work like that. It wouldn't make us happy. Most of us would just stop caring. Especially when it comes to art. You know, art is about breaking rules and taking risks, telling different stories and thinking differently. No one can replace that. Only we artists can. Art is art because we make it. Without us, there's no art. If you have other thoughts about this topic, feel free to share them in the comments. Just keep it constructive and fair. And I'm open to hearing different perspectives. As always, cheers.